shining. Jesus, light of the world, shine upon us. Set us free by the truth you now bring us. Shine on me. Shine on me. Shine, Jesus, shine. Fill this land with the Father's glory. Blaze, Spirit, blaze. Set our hearts on fire. Flow, river, flow. Flood the nations with grace and mercy. Send forth your word, Lord, and let there be light.
Good morning and welcome to another episode of Let the Bible Speak. My name is Alex Meredith. I'm really glad to be here with you this morning. We are starting a brand new series today, and I think it's one that will be immensely valuable for us today. So before we get into that, I actually want to start by painting you a bit of a picture. Imagine it's 1940. Poland, Belgium, and most of France at this point has fallen to Nazi Germany. The United Kingdom itself was on the brink of defeat as they had sent forces into the European mainland and they had been battered, especially in France. And Neville Chamberlain was the prime minister at the time, pushing for appeasement to come to some sort of agreement with Nazi Germany and essentially surrender. It was at this time that around May of 1940 that he eventually resigned, having lost the confidence of the Conservative and Labour parties. And Winston Churchill, quite reluctantly, I might say, accepted the appointment as the new Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. In June 4th of 1940, he made a rather famous speech to a very divided and uncertain United Kingdom Parliament who was very much on the fence about what to do as they faced the very real threat of German invasion to the British island. Here's a little bit of that speech. I have myself full confidence that if all do their duty, if nothing is neglected, and if the best arrangements are made as they are being made, we shall prove ourselves once again able to defend our island home, to ride out the storm of war, and to outlive the menace of tyranny, if necessary for years, if necessary alone. At any rate, that is what we are going to try to do. This is the resolve of His Majesty's government, every man of them. That is the will of Parliament and the nation. The British Empire and the French Republic, linked together in their cause and in their need, will defend to the death their native soil, aiding each other like good comrades to the utmost of their strength. Even though large tracts of Europe and many old and famous states have fallen or may fall into the grip of the Gestapo and all the odious apparatus of Nazi rule, we shall not flag or fail. We shall go on to the end. We shall fight in France. We shall fight on the seas and oceans. We shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air. We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender. And even if, which I do not for a moment believe, this island or a large part of it were subjugated or starving, then our empire beyond the seas, armed and guarded by the British fleet, would carry on the struggle until, in God's good time, the new world, with all its power and might, steps forth to the rescue and the liberation of the old. That is, I've heard a lot of speeches in my time and a lot of monologues, that kind of thing, and that is perhaps the most powerful and well-formed speech I've ever heard. It's incredible, really, the effect that it actually had. 3 months after that speech was given, the Blitz began, an 8-month bombing campaign on England, primarily focused on the city of London, where the Germans horrified and terrified the citizens of England. Even then, Churchill's speech fortified the British people, particularly the authorities in Parliament, to hold out and to continue fighting until the Allied resistance was able to begin pushing back in December of 1941, which eventually led to victory. All of that simply to say that leadership really matters, especially when you're at war. And that is the basis for all of what we're going to be talking about in this series. Leadership, particularly godly leadership. We're starting this series called The Crown. We're going to be looking at the early years of the Israelite monarchy, particularly focusing on the lives of Saul and David. And I think in this series, we will learn quite a lot about godly leadership. And of course, when we talk about godly leadership, I really do believe that is something that in our modern society as it exists today, we are severely lacking in. More than anything, really though, this series demonstrates our need for Jesus. So we're going to look at 1 Samuel chapter 8 today. That's where we're going to start this series. 1 Samuel chapter 8. And this passage, it's all about Samuel. As you might suspect from the book being called 1 Samuel, even though Samuel's not around for the entirety of this series. So Samuel is a prophet of God. He is a judge of Israel, meaning that at the moment he is in the state of authority prior to the establishment of the Israelite monarchy. It's a limited kind of authority, and it's a very particular kind of authority. Samuel was very much a religious political figure. So, a little bit of the background here before we get into the detail. Israel at this point had been in the Promised Land about 300 years. They had arrived in the book of Joshua, around Joshua chapter 6, when they cross the Jordan River, and then the first city they overtake is the city of Jericho. From that point onward, it was Israel's job to live in the land that God had promised them, thus it being called the Promised Land. It was promised to Abraham way back when. So they were in the land of Canaan, and it was their responsibility to wipe out all signs of idolatry and to be a light unto the nations as they worshiped the one true God, Yahweh, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. And that was supposed to create an example for everyone else. But here's the problem, of course. They did not follow that model. And you had this period known as the Judges era, which was really a period of complete spiritual anarchy, right? This period where people were living however they wanted to live. That's what was shown at the end of the book of Judges, Judges 21-25. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. So Israel desperately needed leadership. And here's the problem. Samuel was in charge now. And yes, he was a judge. He was made judge over Israel. You see that in 1 Samuel 7:25, or 1 Samuel 7:15 rather. But he was dying soon. And his sons were not fit to lead. This is something we see in the beginning of chapter 8. So the question is, who's going to lead them in the right direction? So I'm going to start reading in 1 Samuel chapter 8, beginning in verse 1, and work our way through the whole chapter. It's not a very long chapter, so we're going to read verses 1 through 22. When Samuel became old, he made his sons judges over Israel. The name of his firstborn son was Joel, and the name of his second, Abijah. They were judges in Beersheba. Yet his sons did not walk in his ways, but turned aside after gain. They took bribes and perverted justice. Then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah, and said to him, Behold, you are old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now appoint for us a king to judge us like all the nations. But the thing displeased Samuel when they said, Give us a king to judge us. And Samuel prayed to the Lord. And the Lord said to Samuel, Obey the voice of the people in all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them, according to all the deeds that they have done. From the day I brought them up out of Egypt, even to this day, forsaking me and serving other gods, so they are also doing to you. Now then, obey their voice. Only you shall solemnly warn them and show them the ways of the king who shall reign over them. So Samuel told all the words of the Lord to the people who were asking for a king from him. He said, These will be the ways of the king who will reign over you. He will take your sons and appoint them to his chariots, to be his horsemen and to run before his chariots. He will appoint for himself commanders of thousands and commanders of fifties, and some to plow his ground and to reap his harvest, and to make his implements of war and the equipment of his chariots. He will take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. He will take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive orchards and give them to his servants. He will take the tenth of your grain and of your vineyards and give it to his officers and to his servants. He will take your male servants and female servants and the best of your young men and your donkeys and put them to his work. He will take the tenth of your flocks, and you shall be his slaves. And in that day you will cry out because of your king, whom you have chosen for yourselves. But the Lord will not answer you in that day. But the people refused to obey the voice of Samuel, and they said, No, but there shall be a king over us, that we also may be like all the nations, and that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles. And when Samuel had heard all the words of the people, he repeated them to the ears of the Lord. And the Lord said to Samuel, Obey their voice and make them a king. Samuel then said to the men of Israel, Go, every man to his city. So Israel's solution to this problem of spiritual brokenness was, we need a king. We need a king. Now, there are two main problems with this proposition. One of the big problems is that their motivation to have a king was simply to be like the other nations. This is something we see exemplified in verse 5 and then again in verse 20. We want to be like everyone else, like all the other nations. And of course, the problem with that is that they were never supposed to be like all of the other nations. They were supposed to be a beacon into the world, a light unto the nations, somebody that would be different, not only on a moral level, but also on a structural level, with them having God as their king, showing that they don't need somebody or some man to be over them, telling them what to do. They just follow God. So they were never intended to be like everyone else from the start. The other problem with this proposition was simply that in wanting to appoint a human king, they had effectively rejected God as king. That's what God says in verse 7, right? Obey the voice of the people and all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you. They have rejected me from being king over them. Now, here's the thing. You could really make an argument that from this point onwards, in the entire Old Testament, it's really a testimony about how wrong they were. From the time in 1 Samuel 8 up to, you could say, the Babylonian exile several hundred years later, it was really this large testimony about, hey, I told you this wasn't going to work, right? So anything less than true theocracy, where God was directly king, anything less than that was not ideal. But what's so neat about this passage is that God was willing to work with it. He was willing to try to make it work. And in fact, he had a plan in place to make it work. Before we get too deep into that, let's continue on with the passage. Samuel, after they want to appoint a king, is supposed to warn the people, look, if you really want a king, this is what it's going to be like. And essentially, he warns them of the three big dangers. One, he's going to go to war. Wars that you probably won't care very much about or may not even support, but you're going to be conscripted into service. Your sons are going to be conscripted into service. Your daughters are going to have a role to play, right? You're going to have to participate in the larger geopolitical scheme, whether you like it or not, if you want to appoint a king. There are going to be taxes. In verse 15, that's one of the things he starts talking about, right? He's going to take a tenth of everything that you have, whether it's your servants or your grain or your orchards, all of this stuff. He's going to take some of it because he has a right to it as your king. And you're not going to like it. And then thirdly, he says ultimately you're going to be disappointed, whether it's because of the taxes and the war and everything else, or for whatever other reason. He says in verse 18, in that day you will cry out because of your king. You're going to be disappointed because if you put your trust in people, and this is really the overarching message in the whole narrative from this point onward, if you put your trust in people, you are going to be disappointed. If you put your trust in God, you will not be let down, but if you put your trust in people, you are going to be disappointed. So even still, God allows Samuel to appoint a human king. This is what he says in verse 22, obey their voice and make them a king. It was an imperfect solution, but you can make the argument that it's better than total spiritual anarchy, right? God would rather them have perhaps an imperfect system and still be guided in the right direction rather than total anarchy, everybody does what they want all the time. But here's how it's supposed to work. Go to Deuteronomy chapter 17. In Deuteronomy chapter 17, God had already made a provision for this kind of thing. Deuteronomy 17, starting in verse 14. When you come to the land that the Lord your God is giving you, and you possess it, and dwell in it, and then say, I will set a king over me, like all the nations that are around me. God really knew them, didn't he? You may indeed set a king over you, whom the Lord your God will choose. Notice it says God will choose. One from among your brothers you shall set as king over you. You may not put a foreigner over you, who is not your brother. Only he must not acquire many horses for himself, or cause the people to return to Egypt in order to acquire many horses, since the Lord has said to you, you shall never return that way again. And he shall not acquire many wives for himself, lest his heart turn away, nor shall he acquire for himself excessive silver and gold. And when he sits on the throne of his kingdom, he shall write for himself in a book a copy of this law, approved by the Levitical priests. And it shall be with him, and he shall read it in all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear the Lord his God by keeping all the words of this law and these statutes, and doing them, that his heart may not be lifted above his brothers, and that he may not turn aside from the commandment, either to the right hand or to the left, so that he may continue long in his kingdom, he and his children in Israel. So, in other words, God's sovereignty was supposed to be exemplified in this king's life, right? Because the king himself was supposed to model what it was like to be in submission to God and obey his commands. So he was supposed to be an example of godly living, and God's reign was supposed to be realized through him, right? He was supposed to effectively carry out God's will and carry out God's justice. So that's the way it was supposed to work. In essence, all the subjects of authority to this kind of kingship could be more like God by following the leader. And that's really what we're talking about when we're talking about godly leadership. Because the question of leadership, the question of godly leadership is, by following this person's footsteps, are you becoming more like God in the process? You could also think about this from the perspective of leadership. Are people who are following in my footsteps becoming more like God by following me? This is the biblical model of leadership persistent throughout the Old Testament and the New. Let me show you. So we're going to go to Ephesians chapter 5. Ephesians chapter 5, verses 22 through 33. This is Paul talking to the Ephesians on the subject of marriage. And I think he says something very interesting when you think about the way our culture is moving. So Ephesians 5:22, wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church, his body, and is himself its Savior. Now, as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit in everything to their husbands. Now, we use that word submission, right, and talk about wives submitting to their husbands. That's language that we're really not comfortable with a lot of time. But I want you to really look at how this system of authority is presented. Starting in verse 25, husbands, love your wives, as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word, so that he might present the church to himself in splendor, without spot or wrinkle or any such thing, that she might be holy and without blemish. In the same way, husbands should love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. So again, when we think about this idea of submission, it's a scary word sometimes, or at least for some people, especially for people who have found themselves in relationships that are abusive, right? Because many people have misused a position of authority or a position of power for their own selfish desires. That is not the model of authority presented in Scripture. Scripture's model of authority is a system of love. It is a system of respect, and more than anything, it is a system which leads to holiness, right? It is a system which, if the people following the leader are really following them, and the leader is doing what they're supposed to do, they are truly being led closer to God and being led to be more like God. It's a system of love. It's a redemptive system. This is also true when it comes to governmental authority. If you go to Romans 13, Romans chapter 13, beginning in verse 1. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval. For he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid. For he does not bear the sword in vain, for he is the servant of God, and an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Therefore, one must be in subjection not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. So we see here that, again, God's reign is supposed to be realized through this ruler. This is true with all government authorities today. Now, critically, the question always comes up, well, why are so many rulers seemingly opposed to God's will? Well, God gives them a choice. Ideally, they are supposed to be vehicles for God's reign. This is exactly what Psalm 2 is all about. Why do the nations rage? Why do the peoples plot in vain? Because it turns out worldly leaders, even though they are instituted by God, sometimes choose to go against God. But God gives them the choice, and they have the responsibility to follow him. They just don't always do so. But that's the way it's supposed to work. And that was the way it was supposed to work when we're talking about the Israelite monarchy. All of Israel, and in fact all of the world, was supposed to be brought closer to God through this king's reign. We see in Ephesians chapter 6, we're not going to read these, but just to kind of refer to them briefly. This is true when it comes to parents. That's in Ephesians chapter 6. This is true when it comes to elders in the church in 1 Timothy chapter 3. There is this pattern that we see all throughout Scripture where leadership is supposed to be God-honoring. Now, Israel's challenge, when we really examine where Israel's at in 1 Samuel chapter 8, the challenge for them is going to be twofold. For one thing, they're going to have to figure out who, if anybody, is qualified for such an important role and position in Israel. Because they're going to be tasked with a lot. They are carrying forward this mission which the Israelites had when they first got into Israel, which was to continue to eliminate all presence of idolatry in the land of Canaan, which they were supposed to have already done, but was not yet done. And in fact, that's something that David later on gets very involved in. They're also just going to have the moral responsibility of being this godly example. And anyone in leadership knows what a big burden that is and what a big challenge that is. The second question is, once they decide who, or rather, once God decides who would be qualified for this position, will the leaders be godly leaders? Because like I mentioned earlier, they're going to have a choice. Each and every one of you who find yourself in a position of authority and leadership, whether that's in the home, whether that's in the workplace, whether that's in the church, each and every one of you has the decision, once you are in that position, whether you're going to lead people down the right path or whether you are going to lead people down the wrong path. I want to flip back to the other side of this now for a second. When you think about who you look to for your leaders, who are you putting your trust in? And who are you allowing to lead you? Is it a political figure? Is it a family member? Is it a friend that has a lot of influence in your life? Because the reality is, when we talk about people and their leadership of us, people are always over-promising, right? And you've seen it in politics all the time, right? Because every politician that is not yet elected, what do? They promise utopia. They make these promises of, if you elect me, if I could just be in office for just a little bit, I would fix all of your problems. All of the world's problems would be solved. I've got the answers. Be wary of people who believe they have all the answers. Because there's only one person who's ever walked this earth who had all the answers and could bring the solution to every problem, and that person is Jesus. There's only one king who won't disappoint you, and that's Jesus. And that really is the entire message of the stories of Saul and David, that Jesus is the only one who won't disappoint. We'll get more into that later. But choose your leaders wisely, because it matters, especially when we're at war. And we are at war, aren't we? It really does matter. Who do you choose? I'll leave you with that question, just something to think about as we begin this journey in talking about godly leadership. Again, there are two sides of this. One is thinking about yourself as a godly leader, and perhaps you are in a position of influence where you have the opportunity to lead people in the right or wrong direction. And of course, the other side is, where are you looking to be led? Well, that's going to wrap us up here for today. I do want to, before we go, tell you about our Bible correspondence course that we do offer to everybody, totally free of charge if you want to participate. It is a workbook series, essentially. We send you the first one. It's got some study materials for you to look at, some pages for you to fill out. You send it back to us, and then we give you some feedback and send you the next one, and each subsequent one for all 7 books. If you want to participate in that and you don't have a Bible, please let us know. Or if you don't have a Bible anyway and just want one, we've got several available to you, totally free of charge, once again. If you're interested in any of that, our contact information is up on the screen. You can reach us by mail at the Marquette Church of Christ, P.O. Box 372, and that's in Marquette, Michigan, 49855. You can also find a lot of this information on letthebiblespeak.net. You can also listen to us on our relatively new podcast now by searching Let the Bible Speak UP on Spotify and Podbean. That is also our YouTube channel, by the way. I hope you have a wonderful rest of the week. May God bless you in all that you do. Have a great week.
The Father's glory blaze.